This is a book about power, about love, about betrayal. This is a political story about a hero who saved the world and lost it. It was a time when the world was mean and raw. Britain about 450 AD, when human history was being reshaped by forces as elemental as nature itself. This was the entrance to the Dark Ages. Out of that darkness walked a group of extraordinary men. Maybe fantasies, maybe not. A king and his followers who emerged to rally the British, hold off a barbarian invasion and tame anarchy. For a while, they would push back the darkness and begin what legend calls a golden age. King Arthur, the hero king who gathered the best fighters he could find and waged war to restore civilization. The warrior king who hacked order out of chaos with sword and mace and battle axe, who righted old wrongs and reigned in justice and peace for a brief, shining moment. That story spread all over Europe. It was written down by hand and lovingly illustrated in early French romances. It was fully compiled for the first time in the 12th century by a Welsh cleric named Geoffrey of Monmouth. It was recreated in the 15th century, partially from the French, by Sir Thomas Malory, and his masterpiece would shape the legend as we know it. A story to be copied, spoofed, pilfered, and echoed from that day to this.
Part of Star Wars was an experiment with taking some of these ideas and saying, if I put this into a modern context, will these psychological drives still function? And they do. I mean, I really attribute most of the success of the film based on the fact that a lot of the themes and psychological motifs that are in it have been around for 3,000 or 4,000 years.
Here, on the coast of Cornwall, some 2,000 years ago, civilization came to Britain with the Romans. The Romans found a tribal people, fierce and warlike, who passed their beliefs and history on by word of mouth, and practiced a primitive religion that included human sacrifice. These were the Celts, the original British, and barbarians compared to the legions of Rome. The Romans first came to Britain for its tin. They returned as conquerors, bringing with them highly developed artistic and engineering skills. They built luxurious public baths and other systems the Celts could not have dreamed of. They built cities where London and Winchester rise today. But more important than streets and plumbing, the Romans brought literacy, learning, law, and a new religion. The fundamentals of Western civilization. They stayed nearly 400 years. And then they were gone. In their wake was a legend born that would shine down the corridor of centuries.
A great stone, 4 square, like unto a marble stone, and in the midst thereof was like an anvil of steel, a foot on high, and therein stuck a fair sword, naked by the point. And the letters there were written in gold about the sword, that said in thus, Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England.
Today they still tell the story of the callow boy who became the most powerful man in the world. And Merlin, the sorcerer, who guided him to greatness, of the Round Table Knights, the best in the world, and the best of these, Sir Lancelot du Lac, of Guinevere, Arthur's queen, and Tristan and Galahad and the others. Audiences still are captivated by the legend of this king.
It was then that Merlin arranged a miracle. As Arthur the youth pulled the enchanted sword from where it was embedded in the stone, and its very authority made him king.
This is 1993, at the annual Renaissance Pleasure Festival near San Bernardino, California. Each spring they recreate the 16th and 17th centuries here. They also look to a mythic time, when history and legend are thoroughly woven together.
The sword of power. For a time, Arthur ruled from the splendor of a hilltop city called Camelot. For a brief and shining moment, it was a golden age.
There never really was a golden age, of course. But there may well have been a fragment of history which inspired this tale. A 5th century military leader who rallied Romanized Britons to hold off, however briefly, invasions by continental barbarians, the Saxons and the Angles. Some believe this may have been the figure on whom Arthur was based. The search for him begins here, at Glastonbury Abbey.
Glastonbury is a very strange, very ancient place. It used to be almost an island, and there were Celtic beliefs in an Isle of Avalon, the enchanted island of apples, a place of fairy folk and immortality. Because of this belief that Glastonbury was sort of enchanted and strange and otherworldly, that it was also the first Christian site in Britain, it became very, you might say, spiritually charged, and its story became involved with Arthur. There was always a mystery about where Arthur was buried, if he was buried, but it's said that a Welsh bard finally gave away the secret to the English king, Henry II, that Arthur was buried in Glastonbury Abbey's graveyard. The abbot, a few years later, ordered an excavation. They went down quite a long way, and they found a big stone slab with a lead cross underneath it with Arthur's name on it, and they found a rather rough kind of coffin made out of a hollowed-out log with the bones of a tall man inside it and a woman's bones, and they took it this was Guinevere. And this is where, reputedly, the monks found Arthur's grave, here on this spot where I'm standing now. Well, what are we to make of this story? About 30 years ago, Dr. Radford, a very eminent archaeologist, excavated here. He found the story checks out as far as you can check it out. The monks had dug, there were traces of their excavation, and deep down he did find the stone lining of a very ancient grave. They had certainly found somebody. The question, of course, is whether they had found Arthur. This depends on the cross with his name on it. That has disappeared. It's possible it might still be found. There are facsimiles of it. But, of course, it might be genuine, possibly. Or they might have faked it to prove that the grave was Arthur's for the greater glory of Glastonbury Abbey. Who knows? It's a rather interesting mystery.
On the map, this is Cadbury Hill, but the locals call it Camelot. Every king must have his castle. We do know that this was once a great king's lair, and this is where the search for the historical counterpart continued.
There is quite a long-standing tradition about a place called Cadbury. This is an ancient hill fort dating from long before Arthur's time, even before the Romans, where people settled on top of a hill and fortified it with lines of earthwork fortifications and stockades and so forth. That tradition was investigated by archaeologists, and they found, in fact, that the hill had been reoccupied and refortified on an enormous scale at about the right time for Arthur. Evidently, some man, some king with great resources of manpower, really had lived on that hill at just about the right time. And perhaps what's more interesting is that many more of these hill forts have been excavated since, and nobody has found anything really like that anywhere else in Britain.
In 1966, archaeologists began the excavation of South Cadbury Hill, assisted by a somewhat younger Geoffrey Ashe. The dig lasted for 5 years and provided numerous artifacts that suggest a 5th century leader who might be linked to the King Arthur of legend. South Cadbury Hill has been privately owned for centuries. Its reigning monarch today is Mrs. Elizabeth Montgomery, amateur historian and archaeologist and professional dairy farmer. Her interest in the Arthur question understandably is high, and having granted permission for the dig, she managed to keep some of the find for her own collection.
This big pot was about 3rd or 4th century BC and would have been a cooking pot that they would have used by having a hole in the ground in which they lit a fire, and when the fire died down, they put their pot complete with its stew to cook. And of course, one day the pot broke, and the dinner must have been lost that day. I mean, I've always grown up that the hill was called South Cadbury Castle or Camelot. No one knew whether Arthur existed. No one still knows for certain.
It's very doubtful whether we shall ever be quite sure of this, unless there is some sort of new discovery. We know things about Arthur's setting. It would be around the 5th century AD, something like that. But this great fortification with the gatehouse is unparalleled. Britain had been part of the great worldwide Roman civilization for a very long time. Now, it broke away politically around the year 410 and passed into what seems to have been a time of trouble. But something of the Roman system of government probably survived. There was the church, there was the use of Latin by the educated classes, and there would certainly have been people in Britain who felt they were still part of the great civilization, and even that they were putting up a fight for it as the barbarians closed in. So very possibly the original Arthur was someone who to some extent restored civilizations, who fought back the barbarians, who brought back something of what seemed to have been lost in the breakaway from Rome. And this would have given him a very special kind of prestige in tradition, and this may have had some considerable effect on his legend. The director of excavations, Professor Leslie Alcock, would never quite commit himself. He said it was an Arthur-type figure. I think that's quite well put.
A piece of steel heated and beaten into shape becomes a sword. That sometimes happens to legends, too. Under the right conditions, myth can produce historical fact. In the 9th century, Alfred the Great was an Arthur-type figure who saved England from the Danes and etched deeper the image of the hero king. In medieval times, the myth of King Arthur was taken as true by many people, and as such, it made its mark on history. This story and its hero helped to shape a new national identity for Britons, Saxons, Angles, and Danes, for immigrants and invaders from all across Europe. The growth of this legend was part of the same process which raised the magnificent structures of church and state, of the very formation of England. And it frequently was used to legitimize authority.
Virtually every period has tried to claim Arthur, or at least kinship to Arthur. The Plantagenets claimed at one point descent from Arthur. The Stuarts did, the Tudors did. There's been at least one effort to trace the present queen back to King Arthur. So whether or not he existed, he seems to be everyone's ancestor, simply to provide greater legitimacy to a long line of rulers at any point.
Edward I probably had this round table replica built in the 13th century. In the 16th, Henry VIII had his picture painted on Arthur's place at the table. Both were efforts to strengthen the claim of legitimacy. Legitimacy, of course, required control, and control rested on the blade of a sword. King Arthur was, first of all, a warrior.
Then waxed the battle, passing hard on both parties. But Arthur was glad that his knights were horsed again, and they fought together, that noise and sound rang by the water and the wood.
In the building of civilization, first came the discipline of battle, the code of the warrior, demanding courage, skill, loyalty, and self-control. But progress required something more. The word for it came from the French term for horseman. It was called chivalry. In those harsh times, chivalry meant much more than courtly manners.
Then the king stablished all his knights, and charged them never to do outrageousness nor murder, and always to flee treason. Also by no means to be cruel, but to give mercy unto him that asks his mercy, and always to do ladies, damsels, and gentlewomen succor upon pain of death. Also that no man take no battles in wrongful quarrel for no law, nay for no world's goods. Unto this were all the knights sworn of the Table Round, both old and young.
Lancelot, the best of knights. Galahad, the purest. The love-doomed Tristan, the vengeful Gawain. Arthur's son, the wicked Mordred. Kay and Bors, Arthur himself. All encased in the shining armor of a deeply moral tale. Probably were created by a scoundrel imprisoned in the Tower of London. Thomas Malory was accused of attempted murder, rape, cattle rustling, plundering a church, and beating up an abbot.
Whether he was largely a political prisoner or whether he was also a common criminal, we don't know. But he was imprisoned for at least a year, and all the evidence is this is the Thomas Malory who also wrote one of the great monuments of medieval literature.
We don't know a lot about Thomas Malory, but we do know he was a man of his time. A time like Arthur's that was very much out of joint. These were the days of the robber baron and of unconnected knights on the prowl. Freelancers, they were called. In a lawless era, they took what they wanted when they wanted it. Malory may have been one of these, but if so, he also had another side. This is a handwritten copy of the book, dating back more than 500 years and found only in 1934 at Winchester College. Peter Field is one of England's leading experts on the book and its author.
The Winchester manuscript is the only surviving medieval manuscript of Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur. And in 1934, it was found in the bedroom of the warden of Winchester College and identified by the librarian of Winchester College as a copy of Malory's Morte d'Arthur. That was one of the great literary sensations of the 20th century. The image of Malory that we get from the book is very different from the image of Malory that we get from the records of his life. And to Malory as an author, the person that we know when we read the book and see through his eyes and feel with his feelings, we meet a man who is an admirer of the ideals in human behavior, and especially of courage and of loyalty and of endeavor. But a man who does not disguise from himself the fact that the world in which these things are struggled for by some people is a world in which the vicious and The unadmirable is frequently successful. The bad appears in strong forms as well as the good. People nowadays can relate to this, even if they live in worlds that are different beyond belief from the world of Sir Thomas Malory.
From its beginning, King Arthur has been an anachronism. Set in the distant past, it generally has worn the clothing and dealt with the themes and issues important in the time of the storyteller.
Arthur can be almost whatever you want him to be, and I think that it captures people's imagination in a big way.
Robert Mackenzie has his master's degree in medieval literature, but he makes his living turning out medieval armor at his shop in Truckee, California, near Lake Tahoe.
Arthur encompasses such a large scope because you have him everything from the 5th century, the historic Arthur, as he probably existed, through the 15th century when Malory was describing him in terms of as if he were a contemporary, and purely the fantasy Middle Ages, like in the movie Excalibur, where there was a Middle Ages that never existed. Well, this suit of armor is typical of the suits that were built in the late 15th century in northern Italy. It's relatively light, about 65 pounds, and very, very flexible, so you can move readily in it. You can see that almost the entire body is covered by a series of articulated plates that move with the wearer, allowing him to grasp his weapon, to wield it well. The knight's feet were protected by special shoes called sabatons. You can see how flexible they are. He's allowed to step forward readily. Now, he's not going to do a lot of walking or marching in these, but if he does have to walk, he's going to be able to. The hand is covered by the piece that we call the gauntlet, the arm covered by the piece we call the vambrace, and the shoulder by the pauldron, which you can see is made up of a series of smaller, moving, flexible pieces which allow the arm to go up and down readily and afford excellent protection against a weapon like this one. This is a 15th century cut and thrust sword, and against armor like this, a sword like of this nature would not be particularly effective. It will stop it quite readily. So, what do you do against a person that's armored this way? What do you do against a person whose legs and whose feet are so well armored that you're not going to cut through it with the traditional weapons of the knight? Well, this was a good option. This is a mace. It's perhaps not going to even penetrate the armor. These flanges on the mace are quite dull, actually rectangular in cross-section, but will strike with tremendous concussion, tremendous impact, dent a helmet like this readily, and do grievous injury to the person within. A mace like this weighs 3.5 pounds, but all the weight's out on the head, so it will strike with a tremendous degree of force. We've tried it, and I'm sure it works. The way I looked for this shop for years, as I was a kid, I kept looking for this shop, and every time I'd go to an antique store, I'd look for the armor, and of course it never was there. So I had to invent the shop. Here we are.
Beneath the breastplate lies the heart, a source of infinite complication and trouble for many a knight, then and now. Malory's women, like his men, were both saints and sinners. Marriages generally were arranged affairs then, and romantic love usually was found outside the marriage vows. And so the relationship between knights and women gave us that medieval variation on morals, manners, and social graces, known as courtly love. Lifted from the illuminated pages of 12th century romances, the best knight and the best love story were a French import. Lancelot fell in love with his king's wife. The legend would never be the same.
The main story was then taken up by a number of French writers, the most famous of them being Chrétien de Troyes, who wrote a number of romances with a love interest, a much stronger love interest, very chivalric, and enormously popular. And it was Chrétien who more or less invented the figure of Lancelot and the story of Lancelot's love for Guinevere.
The lady sends the knight on quests and judges his deeds. She also leads him to sin. The struggle between love and loyalty is played out in their affair. This was one of the fault lines along which an empire would crack.
The romantic interest of the story is Lancelot's love for Guinevere, Arthur's queen. And you have there the very ancient pattern of the eternal triangle and the terrible dilemma of Lancelot, who is the greatest knight in Arthur's court, who is totally loyal to Arthur, but at the same time is totally in love with Arthur's queen and equally loyal to her, so that there is inevitably a tragic clash.
Queen and lover, a symbol of authority and virtue, and of unfaithfulness. Guinevere represents the imperious contradictions of love and their potentially disastrous consequences.
We could see various themes embodied in the story. Wisdom as a ruler in Arthur himself, chivalry in Lancelot, love in Guinevere, holiness in Galahad. Many of these characters could be seen as embodying something, and perhaps above all, Merlin, the desire for the belief in mystery and magic.
Merlin, the devil's son they called him, emerged from this cave to give Arthur life and lead him to greatness. He too may have been based on a genuine article, a transition figure who was part druid, part Christian. Merlin. He was clearly something more than just an evil sorcerer.
He is, in the sense, a great political figure. He creates Arthur's kingdom. He creates the Round Table originally. And in the end, he is captured by being all too human, that a woman entraps him, learns his secrets, and shuts him up in some kind of mysterious prison. So he is not invincible. He's something like us.
Tintagua. The legend says that in a castle on this spot, Uther Pendragon sired Arthur. In the cliff below is Merlin's cave. Not a cave, really, but a tunnel, carved by the awful powers of the sea. Behind these stones and shadows, we can imagine the place it all began. A place of passage, where the past flows into the present, where myth and history flow together, and a corridor to the dark side. Darth Vader is a modern creature of the dark side, and a sharp twist on the Arthurian conflict between father and son.
And what really grabs the audience more than anything is the underlying psychological motif or fantasy, where you get eroded by the evil side, the anger, the bitterness that turn you into, in essence, what Vader was at one point, which is a mechanical man, a man with no soul and no feeling.
Luke, help me take this mask off.
But you'll die.
Nothing can stop that now.
In the Star Wars saga, Luke saves his father's soul, and good triumphs over evil. In their struggle, an evil empire dies. But Le Morte Arthur is a tragedy. Arthur and his knights are powerful men with powerful flaws. Theirs is a world where mere accident and unintended consequence combine with the wages of sin to destroy the hero and his realm.
The ancient stories tell how Arthur begot a son unknowingly on his half-sister. And consequently, the son, Mordred, is the product both of adultery and of incest. Arthur goes abroad to conduct a war. Mordred is left behind as his grown-up son to look after the kingdom, betrays him, tries to capture Guinevere, and eventually Arthur returns and fights Mordred. Now we have here a classic case, a kind of Oedipus complex in a way, but also that great traditional story of the battle between father and son, which has so many psychological implications.
And there King Arthur smote Sir Mordred under the shield with a thrust of his spear. And right so he smote his father Arthur with his sword holden in both his hands. And therewithal Sir Mordred fell back stark dead to the earth. And the noble Arthur fell in a swoon to the earth.
We come to the inevitable human tragedy. Arthur is not only a king, he is a man, and a man must die.
Like its hero, the legend too would seem to die, killed by the dragons of satire and ridicule and trivialization. Don Quixote, the first modern novel, was a spoof on the questing knight. Mark Twain had enormous fun putting a wily, practical Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's court. And still later, Arthur's own countrymen would savage him.
Look, my liege! Camelot! 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 It's only a model. Shh. Knights, I bid you welcome to your new home. Let us ride to Camelot!
We're knights of the round table, we dance where we're able. We do routines, we chorus scenes, with footwork impeccable. We dine well here in Camelot, we eat ham and jam and spam a lot. We're knights of the round table, our shows are more mid-table. So many times we're given rhymes that are quite unsingable. We're off from mad in Camelot, we sing from the diaphragm.
Camelot, in the desert, only in Las Vegas.
Welcome to the fabulous Excalibur Hotel Casino. I am King Arthur. Join me on a guided tour of the largest and most exciting hotel in the world.
A carnival, a circus, a sideshow attraction, from breakaway weapons to head-bashing knights. Merlin in sequins, knights in plastic armor. The Round Table is a supper club act. The legend of King Arthur has never looked so tacky.
On second thoughts, let's not go to Camelot. It is a silly place. Right.
And the unkindest cut of all, trashed in his own birthplace. In modern Tintagua, Arthur is ballyhooed and sold, with sandwiches and souvenirs. Oh, how the mighty are fallen.
If Arthur is a mythic presence in the 20th century, as he has been for many other centuries, he is a mythic presence whose character does not have to be reserved for high seriousness, for serious literary retellings. It also has penetrated popular culture and folklore to an extent that very few other fictional or barely historical figures have. And I think that's the best proof of the importance of Arthur today.
People say that we don't have heroes anymore, but I think people would like to have heroes. And if you have to have them in stories, why, so be it.
John Cullen Murphy is a Connecticut Yankee with a different slant. From a small studio behind his house in Costco, Murphy turns out one of the longest-running comic strips in America, Prince Valiant, based on the legend of King Arthur.
I think the saga of Prince Valiant and the legend of King Arthur really appeals to people all over the world. People are in need of heroes today, probably more than have been in a long time. And they also love romance, excitement, chivalry, beautiful women, and strong, courageous knights. It appeals, it has a universal appeal. It had an appeal even back in the 1100s in England and in France. We lean on Malory and Tennyson and Geoffrey of Monmouth and people like that, mainly as to the characters, but our plots are human plots. People were the same then as they are today, really.
Prince Valiant hits the streets every Sunday morning in 350 cities in 18 countries, including Japan. It has endured generation after generation.
Prince Valiant has a wide readership, cuts across all ages. And we have fans. I get a number of letters every week, and many of them are from people that say that they've been reading it from the very beginning. So these people must be in their late 60s or 70s or 80s. But the young people seem to enjoy it too.
A startling thing happened in Malory's Camelot. A miraculous visitation by the Holy Grail. The cup used by Christ at the Last Supper appeared briefly before the knights and fed them and vanished. The entire round table vowed to find the cup again, seeing in it a challenge none could refuse. The quest for the Grail proved to be a trial of the soul. Rashly undertaken by most, it was a lethal obstacle course that would kill many of Arthur's knights and greatly weaken his realm. A foolish adventure, perhaps, but also a glimpse of transcendence, a reach that exceeded their grasp.
The quest for the Grail is itself a crucial part of the Arthurian legend because it contains in it the notion of quest itself. We are looking for something. We are on a quest to find something. The Grail, after all, can be anything, and it is often used as a metaphor for anything we are seeking.
The 19th century saw the most famous adaptation of the book till that time by England's poet laureate, Alfred Lord Tennyson. Tennyson lamented an idealism pulverized by the Industrial Revolution.
A number of Victorians had a strong sense of the dangerousness of the world, and therefore Tennyson was well able to call upon that in evoking that sense of doom and the collapse of empire.
And in the disillusioned twilight of a dying age, he wrote the great king's complaint of God.
For I, being simple, thought to work his will, and have but stricken with the sword in vain, and all whereon I leaned, in wife and friend, is traitor to my peace, and all my realm reels back into the beast, and is no more. My God, thou hast forgotten me in my death.
One of the paradoxes of Tennyson is that he set out to write a story that would be a reaction against his own time, and that would suggest that it ought to be an optimistic epic. And in fact, it turns very quickly into a pessimistic epic, that beauty, that goodness, and so on cannot last. And the Arthurian story, as would be said later, becomes one brief shining moment, after which the world returns to the chaos that it was in before.
The mortally wounded Arthur is placed on a barge by his faithful knight Bedivere, and accompanied by 3 queens dressed in black, sets out for the enchanted Isle of Avalon. He would seem to die, but the door of doubt is left open, and the possibility of the hero's return is kept alive.
There was the idea, the constant human yearning for a golden age. And, of course, in the case of Arthur, there was the prophecy, the folk belief, that he wasn't really dead. He's asleep in a cave, or he's on an enchanted island, and someday he will come back and the golden age will return. We haven't really lost it. And one way or another, it has enabled a whole series of authors to take up this story in different ways. And for the story itself, it goes away sometimes, then it comes back. It goes and comes, each according to the different age in which it occurs. But it has this enduring vitality.
In the 1930s, T.H. White published the first volume of The Once and Future King. From the musical comedy it inspired, to the Disney cartoon which followed, it reconditioned Arthur and again recalled a golden age when old wrongs were righted and justice reigned.
Arthur, after all, is once and future. There is a permanency in the legend that makes him available to us, and if he is indeed a mythological figure, if he does satisfy a need for myth for us, there is no reason to think he is any less pertinent to the 20th century, or that he will be later on, than he has been before.
Great myths, and the symbols they produce, and the values and ideals they nourish, are the solder which welds a culture, a link with our roots to which we return in times of trouble.
We have recourse anew to this myth of Arthur in times of particular disunity or unsettled periods. Therefore, when we were unsettled by the death of Kennedy, we did not know what was going to happen afterwards. Certainly, a powerful leader had been removed, and therefore, we create the notion of a Camelot.
The story of King Arthur never really dies, any more than we might hope the spirit of chivalry really dies. It takes different forms. The importance of association, of loyalty to one's friends, and loyalty to some superior ideal. And that, clearly enough, is still strong these days, even if we don't have to dress up in armor and ride around knocking each other off horsebacks.
Excalibur still is a potent symbol, reminding us it is sometimes necessary to use the sword to sustain the process. And we still depend on the moral courage of those who will sacrifice or dedicate their lives to the wider cause. Humanity still needs the example of heroes.
All human beings, I think, need some ideals. They need some sense of community. And they need, if not heroes, at any rate, leading figures for the imagination to follow and perhaps to model themselves on. And you can see this from the very beginnings of Arthurian story.
Many of our ideals are rooted in ancient times, when the civilizing process first began. The need for belief and belonging and benign order has existed from prehistoric times, and from the beginning, we have built structures to house those yearnings. Civilization becomes more sophisticated and complex, but the yearnings remain. To be part of something, to be of use, to be worthy. The Knights of the Round Table tested their worthiness in the search for the Holy Grail. A trial the best of knights would fail, and only the purest would pass.
Sir Galahad knelt and prayed, and his soul was borne visibly to heaven by a company of angels. Then a hand appeared and took the Holy Grail and bore them also to heaven, and no man has seen them since.
But most men remain earthbound, struggling with their frailties, finding strength in unison and dedication. Beneath these arches, the consecration of the individual in the service of a greater meaning continues.
worthily magnify thy holy name. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
The passing on of faith,
Receive the body of our Lord.
the ability to believe in something more important than the self.
A lot of people have given up their lives to push us to the level that we are today. And it's for us to continue to push and push for the right reasons and for the right values. And those values exist in all forms. Some of them exist purely in your gut. Some of them exist in the Bible. Some of them exist in the Quran. Some of them exist in the teachings of Buddha. Some of them are just common sense. And it's taking that and saying there's some validity to this, and if you follow this path, good will come out of it.
God save our gracious Queen, God live our noble Queen, God save the Queen.
The myth travels in time and in space. It changes shape. An image of the human condition. It inspires a centuries-old monarchy. And serves as well in a 20th century democracy. It's a song. The words change, but the music endures.
Some men say in many parts of England that King Arthur is not dead, and men say that he shall come again, and he shall win the Holy Cross. I will not say that it shall be so, but many men say that there is written upon his tomb this verse, Here lies Arthur, the once and future king.